Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. My name is Stephanie Thomas, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar on adverse impact, a guide to adverse impact for HR practitioners. I'm Stephanie Thomas, and I'm the founder of Thomas Econometrics. We are a full-service quantitative consulting firm, and we specialize in quantitative solutions to workplace issues. We focus on adverse impact, disparate treatment, discrimination claims. Basically, if there's a quantitative angle to your workplace issue, we can address that. And before we get started today, I just wanted to make a note that I'm not an attorney. I'm an economic and statistical consultant. So none of the information I'll be presenting today during this webinar should be construed as legal advice. If you have a question about a legal issue, I really encourage you to contact your employment law professionals. They're best positioned to give you the legal answer to your questions. So again, nothing today should be construed as legal advice. Okay, so what is adverse impact? The easiest way to explain what adverse impact is to tell you what it's not. Traditionally, when we think of discrimination, we think of intentional discrimination, or treating somebody differently because of their race or ethnicity, because of their gender, because of their age. It's what we usually think of when we think about discrimination. That kind of discrimination is called disparate treatment. We're treating people differently because of their race or their gender or their age. Adverse impact is a type of discrimination that occurs when a policy or practice that looks to be neutral has a disproportionate effect on members of a protected class. One example of how adverse impact can be created is if you're hiring and you have a college degree requirement as part of the bona fide qualifications for that position. So even though the requirement for a college degree on its face looks neutral, doesn't appear to discriminate against any particular race or gender or age group, when we look at that, because of differences in race and educational attainment, it actually may have an adverse impact on non-whites. So the thing about adverse impact is it's really independent of your intention. You can create a situation of adverse impact without intentionally meaning to discriminate against somebody. And the thing with disparate impact is it's really just a purely statistical question. And the question we're addressing when we look at adverse impact is, did the challenged policy or practice have a disproportionate adverse impact on a protected group? And it's as simple as that. Did the statistics support that the policy has a disparate impact on members of a protected group? If the answer to that question is yes, then the employer has to demonstrate the validity of that practice. If the answer to that statistical question is no, that there isn't statistical support for adverse impact and that it doesn't disproportionately affect members of a protected group, then really that's the end of the story. Typically, when we see adverse impact or disparate impact claims, they're pretty straightforward in terms of the statistical analysis and the ways in which we examine these things. So it's really a statistical question. The intent is irrelevant. And unfortunately, you can actually have a situation of adverse impact without knowing about it if you're not looking at your policies and practices to see if they're creating an adverse impact. So intent is irrelevant. It's purely a statistical question. And since it's a statistical question, we need to talk a little bit about statistics. And we're going to talk about the basics of statistical inference through a simple little coin flipping game. So here's how the game works. I'm going to flip a coin 10 times, and you pay me $1 for every head, and I pay you $1 for every tail. So let's say that I go behind a screen and we don't have a video camera, Skype link, and you can't see me, and I flip that coin 10 times, okay? And then I come out from behind that screen and I tell you I got 10 heads out of the 10 flips, and I demand that you pay me $10. All right? How many people think that you were cheated? And we'll give just a minute or two for answers here. I come back out from behind the screen and tell you I got 10 heads, and I demand that you pay me $10. And the question you have to answer is, have you been cheated? Okay, so the votes are in, and 86% of you said yes, you were in fact cheated, and 14% said no. Well, the question is, how do you know if you were cheated or not? What evidence do you have? What evidence do you have that you were cheated or that you weren't cheated? And basically, the kinds of evidence that you can use to answer this question are direct and indirect evidence. Now, direct evidence is pretty much what it sounds like. It's direct information. So if there was a security camera in the building videotaping me while I was flipping the coin behind the screen, you could review that videotape and see that I actually got 6 heads, and I lied to you and told you that I got 10 heads. So that would be an example of direct evidence. You could also examine the coin. You might look at the coin and see that it's 2-headed, so there's no way that I can get a tail, in which case that would be cheating. You may be able to look at the coin and weigh it and, take samples and see that maybe the coin is weighted towards heads. So I have a disproportionate chance of getting heads because it's not really a fair coin. So all these kinds of direct evidence, videotapes, visual evidence, examining the coin, physical, tangible stuff, that's what we refer to as direct evidence. But what do we do if you don't have any of those things? What if there was no security camera? What if you can't examine the coin? What if no direct evidence exists? Well, in that case, what we need to do is look at indirect evidence. And this is where the statistics part comes in. So I report to you that I got 10 heads and 0 tails. Now, on the flip of a fair coin, there's a 50% chance of heads and a 50% chance of tails. So the probability of any head on a given flip of a fair coin is 50%. So based on that, you would expect 10 heads and out of 10 flips, right? You'd expect half the time we'd get heads, half the time we'd get tails. So you would expect 5 heads and 5 tails out of a flip of a fair coin 10 times. So you expect 5, I actually tell you that I got 10 heads. So we have a surplus of 5 heads here. It's the 10 actual that I reported to you, minus the 5 that you would expect based on what you know about probability and the odds of getting a head on a fair coin flip. So we have a surplus of 5 heads. Now the central question here is this disparity large enough for you to be comfortable accusing me with cheating and doubt that simple chance was the cause? And to answer that question, we can use something called probability. Now, the thing with a coin flip, or really any kind of event, is we don't always get what we expect to get. Out of 10 flips, we would expect 5 heads, but we're not always going to get exactly 5 heads. Sometimes we might get 4 heads, sometimes we might get 6 heads. So more often than not, we're not going to get exactly that 5 heads that probability would tell us we should expect. So what we can do is use probability to answer the question, how likely is it that we would get 6 heads, or 7 heads, or 8 heads, or 9 heads, or 10 heads? And for each of those outcomes, 6 heads, 7 heads, 8 heads, etc., we have a probability associated with that outcome. So if we look at the line here that says 6 heads, you see the 0.205. So getting 6 heads out of 10 flips is expected to occur about 20% of the time. So it wouldn't be that uncommon. When we go down, let's look at the 9 heads. And the probability of getting 9 heads out of 10 flips is 0.01. That's 1%. So you'd expect 9 heads out of 10 flips in every 100 games. It would happen 1 every 100 games. But what about my reported outcome? I told you I got 10 heads. What's the probability of getting 10 heads? Well, if we look at the last line, we see that that probability is 0.001. And what that means is we would expect 10 heads out of 10 flips once in every 1,000 games. So it's a pretty rare outcome. Now, you'll also see that we've got something reported here called SD, and that's shown at the end of each line. So if we go back to the 6 heads, we expect that to happen about 20% of the time. We can convert that to something called units of standard deviation, and it's essentially just a standardized way of expressing probability, so we don't have to get lots and lots and lots of zeros. So 0.205 probability, 20%, in this case is roughly equivalent to 1/3 of 1 unit of standard deviation. 8 heads is equivalent to about 1.6 units of standard deviation. 9 heads, in this example, that 1 out of 100 probability, that's 2.30 units of standard deviation. And the 10 heads, the once out of 1,000, that's equivalent to 3.10 units of standard deviation. So as the units of standard deviation increase from 0.31 to 0.95 to 1.60, as those units of standard deviation increase, it becomes more and more unlikely to see that result over repeated, we call it over repeated sampling. So if we were to play this coin flip game 1,000 times, we would expect to see the 10 heads, the 9 heads, the 8 heads, fewer and fewer. So as we go farther away from our expected value of 5 heads, those outcomes become less likely due to pure random chance. So more units of standard deviation essentially means a smaller likelihood that we would see that outcome. So what does all this mean for our coin flipping game? Well, we expect to get 10 heads out of 10 flips once in every 1,000 games. So theoretically, it's possible that you weren't cheated. It is possible that I actually did get 10 heads out of 10 flips. It's rare. It only happens once in every 1,000 games, but it could happen. The question is that 10 heads and 10 flips, that once in 1,000 games scenario, is that outcome sufficiently rare for you to be comfortable accusing me of cheating? Can we conclude, can we infer that that likelihood is so rare that I did in fact cheat you? So essentially the question becomes, where do we draw the line? How rare is sufficiently rare? Where do we draw that line? And social scientists have a rule of thumb that says anything more than 2 units of standard deviation is considered to be statistically significant. And statistically significant means it's pretty unlikely. We can rule out that the outcome is because of pure chance events. Okay? So social scientists, that rule of thumb is about 2 units of standard deviation. If it's under 2, we can't infer that anything other than chance caused it. If it's greater than 2, it's statistically significant, and we can infer that something other than chance is probably going on. Now, within the context of employment selection decisions and employment law, there was a case in, I think it was 1977, called Hazelwood School District versus the United States. And the Supreme Court in that case ruled on what level of disparity is statistically significant. And they said that a disparity of at least 2 or 3 units of standard deviation is statistically significant. So that decision, the legal standard here, kind of mirrors what social scientists have been using for a long time. So according to the Hazelwood School District case and the Supreme Court, in order for an outcome to be statistically significant, it has to be 2 or 3 units of standard deviation. So what inferences can we draw about the game from what we now know about statistical significance? The probability of getting 10 heads in 10 flips is 1 out of 1,000. And as we saw before, that's equivalent to 3.10 units of standard deviation. So this would satisfy the social science rule of thumb that says anything more than 2 is significant. It also satisfies the Hazelwood threshold of 2 or 3 units of standard deviation. And we conclude that the difference between the actual 10 and the 5 expected heads is statistically significant. And based on that, you would infer that I cheated you. So based on 3.10 units of standard deviation, you could be fairly comfortable concluding that I cheated you and that you probably shouldn't pay me that $10. Now, the thing with statistical significance, it's important to keep in mind that no valid adverse inference can or should be drawn if the disparity is not statistically significant. And that's so important, I'm going to say it one more time. No valid adverse inference can or should be drawn if the disparity is not statistically significant. If a disparity is not statistically significant, it's essentially, from a statistical perspective, equivalent to 0. So if we were looking at employment selection decisions by gender, for instance, and we found a disparity where men were promoted more frequently than women based on what we would expect. So we would say that that difference is adverse to females because not as many females were promoted as we would expect. If that disparity is not statistically significant, we can't infer that discrimination took place. From a statistical perspective, if it's not significant, the difference is equivalent to 0. We can't rule out that that outcome is the result of pure chance. Okay? So 2 or 3 units of standard deviation. If the disparity is not 2 or 3 units, then we can't make any inferences or conclusions about discrimination. Very, very important. So let's see how this whole process would actually play out in terms of a hiring analysis. And let's say that we're hiring for a particular position, and we have 1,000 applicants, and 500 of those applicants are blue, and 500 of those applicants are green. And from that pool of 1,000 applicants, we actually make 200 hires. We hire 120 blue people and 80 green people. Now, when we look at the blue-green composition of our applicant pool, we see that 50% of the applicants are blue and 50% are green. When we look at the blue-green composition of our hires, we see that 60% of our hires are blue and 40% of our hires were green. Now, we can mirror our coin flip example here in this hiring analysis. Because greens are 50% of the applicant pool, we would expect that 50% of our hires would be green. So 50% of 200 is 100. So based on the blue-green mix in the applicant pool, we would expect that 50% of our hires, or 100 hires, would be green. Now we actually see 80. So we expect 100, we see 80, and what that means is there's a shortfall of 20 green hires. We hired fewer green people than we would have expected under a blue-green neutral scenario. And since there's this shortfall, that shortfall is directionally adverse to greens. But the question is it statistically significant? In order to determine whether or not that shortfall of 20 green hires is statistically significant, we can use a fancy formula. It's called the chi-square test. That'll tell us what the probability of hiring only 40% instead of 50% green people was under a green-blue neutral criteria. And when we do that statistical significance calculation, we see a probability of 0.002. So to kind of link it back to our coin flip example, we would expect to see the actual number of blue and green hires twice out of every 1,000 games, out of every 1,000 hiring events. So that probability is equivalent to 2.88 units of standard deviation. And since 2.88 is greater than 2, it meets the social science threshold, and 2 or 3 units, based on Hazelwood, it probably satisfies that criteria too. So this disparity of 20 green hires is statistically significant. And when you get a statistically significant result in a hiring analysis or a promotion analysis or a termination or reduction in force analysis, you really need to follow up on that and find out what's really going on. Is one of the policies or practices creating an adverse impact that you don't know about? Have you maybe defined your study population incorrectly? Do you have the right people that you're looking at and including in that study? So you need to follow up. And let's assume that in our example, we follow up and we see that there's a degree requirement for the position we're hiring for. And for whatever reason, blues are more likely than greens to have that particular degree. So greens are disproportionately screened out because of this degree requirement. So if you think of it in terms of the hiring stage process, everybody submits their applications and the applicant pool is 50% green and 50% blue. And when we initially screen those applications to see who has the degree requirement we're looking for, more blue people than green people have that qualification, so more blues than greens get passed on to the second stage, which might be a phone interview or an in-person interview or some kind of an employment screening test. So this degree requirement here, based on our follow-up, we see is disproportionately screening out greens. So one thing that we can do now is we repeat the analysis, but we're going to repeat it using only qualified applicants rather than the entire applicant pool. And when we repeat this analysis, we see that we now have only 500 qualified applicants. So we had 1,000 applicants before in total, 50% blue, 50% green. When we restrict our pool to just those people who have this particular degree requirement, we see that we only have 500 qualified people. And of those qualified people, 350 are blue and 150 are green. Greens are 30% of our qualified applicant pool. And we still have those same 200 hires, and we still hired the same 120 blue people and 80 green people. So again, we hired 80 greens, 40% of our hires were green. But when we look at the blue-green composition of our qualified applicants, we see that greens are only 30%. And because they're 30%, we would expect that 30% of our hires would be green. So 30% of 200 is 60. So we would expect 60 of our 200 hires to be green. Now when we compare our actual 80 hires with our 60 expected green hires, we see that we have a surplus of 20 green hires. We actually hired more green people than we would expect under a blue-green neutral scenario. So because we have a surplus of 20 green hires, greens actually did better in the hiring process than we would expect. This is directionally favorable to greens. Now, the key thing here, and it's kind of abstract that we're talking about blue and green people for an abstract position, but it really essentially comes down to, what do these analyses tell us? We see that when we look at all applicants, we look at all 1,000 applicants, we have a statistically significant shortfall of green hires. So based on that, it would look as though we discriminated against green people. But when we restrict it to the qualified applicant pool, we see that we hired more greens than we would expect. We have a surplus of hires among the qualified applicants. So essentially, these results are giving us two different directions in which to go. The first analysis tells us that we discriminated against greens, and the second analysis, where we limited it to the qualified applicant pool, tells us that greens were actually favored in this process and they weren't discriminated. So the question is, did this company discriminate against greens in its hiring process? And here I'm going to give you three options. You can vote yes, you can vote no, or you can vote maybe. All right, so let's see what our results are. 57% of you said no, the company didn't discriminate against greens in the hiring process, and 43% maybe. 43% of you aren't really sure if it's discriminatory or not. Nobody thought that the process was discriminatory against greens, for sure. Well, the right answer is maybe. In order to conclude that greens weren't discriminated against, we have to look at the business necessity and the justification of that degree requirement. Because when we use that degree requirement in refining our hiring pool, when we throw out the applicants who aren't qualified, then we actually favor greens in the process. So the question becomes whether or not that particular degree requirement is job related, if it's consistent with business necessity, and whether or not it's justified. So if you can demonstrate, for instance, that that qualification is in fact job related and it's absolutely essentially required to performing that position, then the answer would be no. Greens weren't discriminated against in the process because it's a valid, bona fide qualification for this position. If you can't demonstrate the business necessity and the job relatedness of that degree requirement, then unfortunately it does have an adverse impact and there was discrimination against greens in this hiring process. So it really comes down to whether or not that educational requirement in this case can be justified. And in any kind of selection decision you're making, whether it's a hiring decision, whether it's a promotion decision, whether it's a termination or a reduction in force decision, it's really important to think about what kinds of criteria and what kinds of requirements are going into those decisions. For hiring and for promotions, there may be particular qualifications. There might be specific time and job or seniority restrictions. You really need to think about whether those are related to the job, that the person needs to have those things to be able to perform the job well, and whether or not those things are related to business necessity. If they're not, then you shouldn't be using them because they can create an adverse impact. So we talk about it in terms of validating the criteria. You have to be sure that those criteria are justified, and you need to look at whether or not those criteria have a disparate impact or an adverse impact. Now, the key thing to keep in mind here is just because a particular requirement or screening test has an adverse impact doesn't mean it's illegal. That doesn't mean you can't use it. In this case, we see that that degree requirement does have a disparate impact. It disproportionately screens greens out of the process. But that doesn't mean that it's discrimination and it's illegal. If you can justify the business necessity and the job relatedness of that, then it's perfectly fine to use that criteria. So it's really important to think about the criteria that you're using and whether or not they're related to the job and whether or not you can make that business necessity argument. Now, we've been talking about blue and green people and kind of abstract in terms of coin flip games, and the thing is, what this example was designed to do was to show you the steps of any kind of comparative analysis. And the 3 steps to any comparative statistical analysis are determining the expected outcome, comparing the expected outcome with the actual outcome, and assessing the disparity for statistical significance. So if we were looking at reduction in force analysis with respect to age, and this is a common complaint we're seeing right now given the economy and everything that's going on, what you would need to do is determine the expected outcome by looking at the percentage of age-protected and non-age protected individuals in the pool of employees eligible for termination. That's going to tell you your expected outcome. Then you compare the expected outcome with the actual outcome. Did you select more or less of the protected group? What's the surplus? What's the shortfall? And then the final step is to assess the disparity for statistical significance. So irrespective of what kind of selection decision you're looking at, if it's a particular part of your recruiting or hiring process, if it's promotions, if it's terminations or reductions in force, and even sometimes compensation. Claims in compensation typically are disparate treatment claims where it's intentional discrimination. But there are examples of adverse impact in compensation. For instance, if your compensation is based on a commission schedule with quotas, it may be the case that those quotas have an adverse impact on particular groups. It doesn't mean it's illegal to use those quotas and required sales volumes. You just have to justify that they're consistent with the job and they're consistent with business necessity. But irrespective of what kind of selection process you're looking at, the analysis is basically going to proceed in the same way. You're going to determine the expected outcome. You're going to compare the expected outcome and the actual outcome to calculate a shortfall or a surplus measure. And then you're going to assess the disparity for statistical significance. That's really all there is to an adverse impact analysis in terms of the underlying statistics. Now, how we assess the disparity for statistical significance, and actually even how we determine the expected outcome, is going to differ based on the kind of statistical tool we're using. So let's now talk about some common tools that we use for adverse impact analysis. And the most common tool is something called the 4/5 rule. You may know this as the 80% rule. And this is something that the EEOC uses. Basically, the idea here is that if the selection rate for the minorities is less than 80% of the selection rate for the majority, then according to the 4/5 rule or the 80% rule, that selection process has an adverse impact. So it's essentially looking at the selection rates, and if the selection rates differ by more than 80%, then according to this test, you would infer that this test has adverse impact. Now the 4/5 rule, a lot of people use it because it's very easy to calculate. You can almost calculate it by hand. You certainly can do it in an Excel spreadsheet. The problem with the 4/5 rule is that it's really an arbitrary, non-scientific kind of tool. The 80% that they selected, this was selected by a California commission, and if you read the proceedings of that commission, they actually settled on the use of 80% or 4/5 rather than 75% or 85% or 90%. There were 2 groups of people that were negotiating how this tool was going to work and what the threshold was going to be. And one group strongly supported the use of 70%, and there was another group who said, no, the right percentage, the right threshold is 90%. And they couldn't come to an agreement whether it should be 70 or 90, so they actually split the difference, and that's how we got the 80%. The 80% is not scientific, and it's a completely arbitrary threshold. The other problems with the 4/5 rule or the 80% rule really get into some more detailed statistical concepts. It's insensitive to sample size. So what we mean by sample size is the number of things we're studying. With statistical significance measures and statistical tests, the size of the sample or the number of things you're studying really can have an impact on the results of the test overall. If we have very small samples, the tests don't have what we call power because there's not enough information. And to see this in the context of our coin flip example, if I were to flip a coin once and I got one head, would you be comfortable accusing me of cheating? Probably not, because you don't really have enough information. You only have that one flip. And on any flip, there's a 50% chance of getting heads and 50% chance of getting tails. So based on just one flip, you probably wouldn't accuse me of cheating. The sample size is very small, and we don't have enough information about the process. You haven't seen the coin work enough, so to speak. So the problem with the 4/5 rule is that it doesn't really care about how many things you're studying. You could be studying 2 people, or you could be studying 2,000 people. And the 4/5 rule, the 80% rule, doesn't care about how many things you're studying. And that can be a big disadvantage, because if you're only looking at 2 people, from a statistical perspective, you really don't have enough information to make an assessment about whether that policy or process or procedure has an adverse impact. You can't conclude anything based on 2 people. But with the 4/5 rule or the 80% rule, you still can calculate that selection ratio, and you can essentially make an inference based on that non-scientific rule that adverse impact is or is not present. So it doesn't really consider, it can't consider the number of things we're studying or the sample size. The other problem with the 4/5 rule is that it really doesn't consider the size of the disparity. And when we talk about the size of the disparity, we're really talking about something that I call practical significance. Now, when we talk about statistical significance, we have a very finite boundary. If it's 2 or more units of standard deviation, it's statistically significant, and we would infer within the context of adverse impact that the test or the requirement or the qualification or the process has an adverse impact on a protected group. So we have a very definite threshold for statistical significance, and it's 2 units of standard deviation. With practical significance, we're not looking at the question of how rare is sufficiently rare. What we're looking at with practical significance is how big is big enough to matter. And there is no definitive threshold for practical significance like there is with statistical significance. So if we were to see a hiring disparity of 10 people, is 10 people, 10 green people big enough to matter? Well, in some circumstances it might be. In other circumstances it might not be. And even within those same circumstances, it may be big enough to matter to some people and not big enough to matter for others. So if we go back to that blue-green hiring example, our initial shortfall of 20 hires out of a total of 200, some people might think that 20 out of 200 hires is in fact big enough to matter, and we should be concerned about it. Other people might think that it's really not big enough to matter, and we probably don't need to worry about it if it wasn't statistically significant. So the 80% rule, the 4/5 rule, it can't look at the size of the disparity, and it doesn't tell us anything about whether or not that disparity is big enough to matter. So even though the 4/5 rule, the 80% rule is easy to use, it's easy to calculate, it's easy to interpret, there really are a lot of problems. And we're going to talk about some very basic statistical alternatives that you can use instead of the 4/5 rule or the 80% rule. I would really strongly discourage you from basing any kind of business decisions or any kind of important changes in your policies or practices based on the 4/5 rule or the 80% rule. It's not scientific, it's arbitrary, and you really need a better tool when you're making those kinds of decisions. And the first alternative tool that's a statistical tool is something called the chi-square test. And the chi-square test is exactly what we did in our example of our blue-green hiring. What we do is we formulate an expectation about how many hires or how many terminations, what have you, based on the composition of the pool. And the chi-square test is a nice simple test that's relatively easy to calculate. Most spreadsheet programs, whether it's Excel or OpenOffice or whatever kind of spreadsheet you're using, most of those have chi-square functionality built in. It's a relatively easy test, it's simple, and it's an accurate, reliable, scientific process. So think about the chi-square as an alternative to the 4/5 or the 80% rule. Now, another common test is something called the Fisher's exact test. And the Fisher's exact test is very similar to the chi-square test. But the difference is the Fisher's exact test is particularly useful when we have small number of things that we're studying. So if we have a very large sample size, if we're looking at lots and lots and lots of decisions, lots and lots of people, the chi-square test probably is going to be the appropriate test. If we have a smaller group of people that we're looking at, and again, the definition of what's a small sample size versus a big sample size is kind of subjective. But when we have smaller sample sizes, the Fisher's exact test is preferred to the chi-square because it's more reliable and it can deal better with those smaller sample sizes. The other kind of test that's often useful is something called the Mantel-Hansel chi-square test. And what the Mantel-Hansel test is used for, and the really great thing about it, is it allows you to combine results across pools. So let's say that we're hiring into 5 different positions. And we do a chi-square test on the applicant pool for position number 1, and we do a chi-square test on position number 2 applicant pool, position number 3 applicant pool, and so on. So we have 5 separate results. But let's say that those 5 positions, we want to see what our overall hiring looks like with respect to blue and green people, or gender, or race, or ethnicity, or age. The Mantel-Hansel test is a statistical tool that lets us combine those results over different pools, over different jobs, over different time periods, over different groupings of things, people, selection decisions. So if you want to get an overall picture, for instance, what your hiring patterns look like over a 2-year period, you may want to analyze those individually every 6 months, but then you could use the Mantel-Hansel to combine those 6-month pools to see what your overall results look like across that 2-year time span. So Mantel-Hansel is a good tool for aggregating or combining groups statistically. And the last tool on this page is something called logistic regression. And logistic regression is different from chi-square, Fisher's exact, and the Mantel-Hansel. With the chi-square, Fisher's exact, and Mantel-Hansel, we're essentially looking at the selection process across 2 dimensions. You can think of it as a 2x2 table. To go back to our hiring example, we have whether or not you're blue, yes or no, and whether or not you were hired, yes or no. So we're classifying people according to blue-green color and whether or not they were hired. So there's 4 possible outcomes. You're blue and you were hired, you're blue and you weren't hired, you're green and you were hired, or you're green and you weren't hired. So it's called a 2x2. We can classify people across 2 dimensions, whether or not they were hired and whether they're blue or green. The logistic regression doesn't use that 2x2 framework. What the logistic regression does, it allows you to calculate a probability, but you can look at more than just 2 dimensions. So if we were interested in looking at a hiring decision, for example, we could look at how the likelihood of being hired is influenced by whether you're blue or green, by the number of years of prior experience that you have, based on your educational attainment. There's a variety of things that you can look at in a logistic regression, and it really gives you the opportunity to build in those other factors aside from just protected characteristic versus hired or not hired, promoted or not promoted. The logistic regression is a lot more complicated to actually build and estimate and get results from. but it does have the advantage that you can add in other factors and look at more than just two dimensions. And sometimes that's a very useful tool. You want to be able to incorporate those additional factors that may increase the likelihood of being hired, may decrease the likelihood of being terminated. So the logistic regression is very versatile, but it is a lot more complicated. You can probably do a logistic regression in Excel, but I wouldn't advise it. It's a complicated process, and it's really something that is probably going to be not something you really want to use on a day-to-day basis. The chi-square test and the Fisher's exact test, on the other hand, those are things that you can do easily in Excel, and you can actually put them to work right now today in looking at your selection processes, your selection decisions for adverse impact. And actually, we have a tool on our website that's essentially an online chi-square calculator. It allows you to test for adverse impact using the chi-square test. So if you go to our website, www.thomasecon.com, you'll see we have something called an AI tool, the adverse impact tool. You can actually calculate adverse impact for your selection decisions right online. So chi-square, Fisher's exact are what you're probably going to be using most of the time if you're doing it yourself. If you're using an outside consultant to look at these adverse impact questions, that's probably where they're going to start. They're going to start with the chi-square or Fisher's exact, depending on the sample size. They may make use of the Mantel-Hansel if you want to look at, collections of results over time or over different job groups or departments. And depending on the particular qualifications and how you make those selection decisions, the logistic regression may be appropriate. But it's a lot more complicated. So those are some of the common tools that we use to look at adverse impact. And there's one final issue that I'd like to talk about, and that's the limitations of what statistics can tell us. And in terms of adverse impact, or really any kind of discrimination, whether it's intentional discrimination like we see with disparate treatment, or unintentional discrimination like we see with adverse impact or disparate impact, statistics cannot prove causality. You cannot prove 100% certain that the process is discriminatory. There's always the possibility that there are other factors at work, aside from discrimination, that may be causing this result. Now, when we look at the 2x2 hiring analysis, if we go back to our blue-greens, where we looked at the entire applicant pool, we looked at all 1,000 people. Based on the results of that test, we would infer that there's something going on, that the shortfall of green hires is statistically significant. And that result's consistent with the hypothesis of discrimination. We can't use it to prove discrimination, but we say it's consistent with the hypothesis of discrimination. But the problem with that analysis is that it was missing that degree requirement. So that would be an other factor that would affect the likelihood of being selected. Now, there may be other factors in addition to degree requirements, licenses and certifications, or other things that you've already accounted for in your model that may be at work. You can't rule out that there are other factors at play, even those you know about or those that you don't yet know about. So we can't ever say that something is proven certain in terms of causality based on the result of a statistical analysis. The only thing we can say when it comes to adverse impact is that the result of the statistical analysis is or is not consistent with the hypothesis of discrimination. And we always have to be on the lookout for those other factors that we may have left out of our model that are playing a role. And we also have to keep in mind that even though it's pretty unlikely to get 10 heads out of 10 flips, it can happen. It happens once every 1,000 times. So even though a result is statistically significant, it doesn't mean for sure 100% causality that you were cheated or that discrimination took place. So it just tells us whether or not the process is consistent with the hypothesis of discrimination. And the other point about what statistics can and cannot do is The results of a statistical test are only as good as the underlying data. So, in the context of a hiring decision, for instance, if you don't have all of the appropriate candidates in your applicant flow pool, if you're not looking at everybody that you should be looking at, or if you're looking at more people than what you should be looking at, the results of the test are going to be impacted by that because your underlying study population isn't defined properly. If you have errors in your data, if you're missing gender, race, ethnicity, age for certain people, that's going to have an impact on the results of the adverse impact test. So your results are really only as good as the underlying data. If you have bad data, if you have data errors, if you have missing data, all of those things are going to feed into the statistical test and make the results less reliable. And the dangerous thing is, unless you actually look at your data, you're not going to know that those results are less reliable. So it's really important before you engage in any kind of statistical analysis or even have an outside consultant do those analyses for you. It's important to review your data, make sure that it's correct, and that everything's filled in, you don't have any data holes, and that you have the best data set possible to carry out that statistical analysis. So statistics can be used for a lot of things, but it can't prove causality, and if you have bad data going into the statistical test, you're going to get bad output, and any kind of conclusions or inferences or decisions that you make based on the outcome of those tests could be flawed because of problems with your data. Okay, so at this point, we'll open the floor to questions. If anybody has questions about anything, please feel free to raise your hand. And we'll give it just a couple of minutes to see if anyone has questions. Okay, well, it looks like there aren't any questions. I'd like to thank everybody for participating today. I hope you found it useful and informative. If you're thinking about this later and you have a question or you want to follow up on something particular. Oh, we do have one question. Is it possible to get a printout of the slideshow? Yes, I will email a PDF file to everybody who participated today. So check your email, that will be coming. But if, like I said, if you have other questions, if you're not sure about something, or after thinking about this, you have a follow-up issue, please feel free to send me an email. My email address is sthomas@thomasecon.com. You can also feel free to give me a call at 215-642-0072. And we'll have a replay of this webinar available on our website in case you want to view it again or if you want to share it with one of your colleagues. You can find it in the archived section for webinars on our website, www.thomasecon.com. Thanks again for participating, and I hope you found it useful. Have a good day.